Thank you. What a pleasure it is to be here, an honor it is to be here. I've been aware, of course, of the work of the Entitled group, been in conversation with some of the students. You want me to?
You have to use it, otherwise the video won't get
okay.
your noise.
This feels like I'm giving a motivational speech here. Yes, you can be an effective scholar. Let me tell you how. All right. So I want to thank Begum and Emily and everyone for inviting me and making it possible for me to come. It's a great honor to be here and to be engaged in the kinds of conversations that Entitle has been nurturing and encouraging. And that is how I would like to present this talk today, not as a series of closed formulations, but as a series of provocations and invitations to the kinds of conversations for a post-Cartesian historical social science that we so desperately need, I think both for intellectual reasons and for political reasons. I think that the dualism of nature and society is not only a violent abstraction in the sense that it abstracts and reifies realities that should not be abstracted and reified, but I think that it is also implicated in a very real violence and blood and dirt, as Marx would say, of the modern world. So this is a series of invitations to talk about the end of cheap nature and what that has meant historically. And at some places in this talk, I will move fairly fast. Other places, I'll move slower. But we'll begin, of course, we know nature is never cheap. All of us would agree with that in this room, I suspect. All of us would carry a very different normative, ethico-political project around what we wish to value relative to historical capitalism, which values basically one thing: labor productivity in the circuit of capital. So we have to ask this question of what is valuable. I think that this has been implicit and at times very explicit in political ecology. I think by and large those discussions have focused on the ethico-political dimensions of what we want to value rather than a deep critique of how capitalism works through the web of life. And so the big pitch that I would make to you is something that will be familiar to most in political ecology. That is, how do we move from thinking about capitalism and nature to capitalism in the web of life? Capitalism in nature, nature in capitalism. This is what I call the double internality as a methodological premise, and that's something I'll return to in just a few moments. So we begin with, I think, what is either implicit or explicit in a lot of green thought, which is that this nature-society binary is arbitrary, it's a violent abstraction, both in intellectual terms, it's a fetish, and in terms of real political and material activity, and it obscures crucial dimensions of our reality because it creates separate boxes of reality that are ontologically prior to each other. I think that what's dawning on a lot of us is that political ecology or world ecology in the ways that I'm talking about it, and by the way, that's world ecology with a hyphen, not the ecology of the world, and I'll try to make that more clear as we go through. I think what's happening is that we understand that political ecology is about more than political ecology of. It's about more than the political ecology of a social process. That we understand that we're not dealing with the political ecology of financialization. That financialization is in itself a crucial modality of environment making in the modern world. So in other words, Wall Street is a way of organizing nature. And when I say organizing nature, I mean human and extra-human nature. So I think one of the crucial challenges that we need to face, and there are several, but this is what I'd like to focus on today, is to move beyond the political ecology, political economy divide. And I think what's happened, and it's a welcome development, is that political ecologists invoke political economy, the political economy of capitalism, of endless accumulation, of the spatial fix, you name it. And the political economists now, certainly critical political economists, Marxist political economists, now have to recognize that in some sense nature, yes, nature matters. Who would have thought? Okay, so, and in this divide, you can see it even in people who are leading authorities on both questions, somebody like John Bellamy Foster. So for John Bellamy Foster, the theory of the tendency of the surplus to rise is abstracted from nature in every sense. And you can make similar observations about a whole string of political economists. That nature still does not really matter to the dominant models of critical and Marxist political economy. We can name a number of exceptions, of course, but I would think if we look at the main accounts of the post-2008 global economy, we see a very strong generalized persistence of this divide. And I think what we need to say is that political ecology provides some of the raw materials for an emerging synthesis with political economy, and that moving beyond this, oh yeah, nature matters, to looking at the models of accumulation and crisis will give us some crucial insights into not only the realities of the present, but how to forge the politics of the present. So what I'd like to focus on in this talk is, I think, is one line of synthesis, and I think that this is one line of many complementary syntheses that need to occur. This is a synthesis with the world historical tradition. At dinner last night, we were having a wonderful conversation about the tradition of political ecology, which is really regional political ecology. And it's a wonderful and dynamic tradition. And there has been a tendency to construct systemic processes as theoretical rather than as concrete historical geographical relations and processes. That yes, the modern world system is a real place, a real historical geographical place with real patterns of the exercise of power, of culture, of environment making, and so on and so forth. And yes, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, but it's also less. Okay, we get that. What we need to do is to move beyond the theoretical construction of the global, and conversely, what we've seen in, say, world environmental history and other global narratives of environmental change is not only an entrenched and pervasive nature-society dualism, but an inability to deal very well with regional dynamics and how do these two inform each other. And this is a particular concern of mine looking at accounts of global environmental change. The Anthropocene is a good example of this, but we could multiply that many, many times over, is that there is still this idea of nature as nature in general. So when, especially when the political economy tradition of environmental change deals with the question of nature, you look at the metabolic rift tradition, for instance, it is nature in general. There is a strong non-recognition that natures are historically specific and that there are specific historical natures, a wonderful term that Marx and Engels give us from the German ideology. There are specific historical natures that are both producer and product of specific eras of capitalist development. So when we make the pitch for world ecology, we are not arguing for a brand new theory. We are arguing for a new mode of theorizing that is historically grounded. What we mean by historically grounded is grounded in the interpretation of historical change in the modern world. And this is a method in the broadest sense of the term, not in terms of research design, of course, but in how do we go about bounding time, space, and nature in the making and unmaking of the modern world. And so this carries forth the tradition of the philosophy of internal relations, which has had great influence both in political ecology and in the world historical tradition. But as Michael Watts once said to me, he said, yeah, well, you know what Phil McMichael writes about incorporating comparison, that's all really interesting and everything, but nobody really does it. And I think that there were good reasons for why people didn't do it. And I think that this is also a limit, that we need to understand that understanding philosophically the relationality of humanity and nature and humanity asks us to deal with the systemic processes of world historical change that asks us to bring to bear a different set of narrative strategies. That the narrative strategies that work for regional analysis do not necessarily matter for systemic analyses. And there's a tension there that I think needs to be teased out. So when we say that the modern world system is a capitalist world ecology, we say that this means that the accumulation of capital, the pursuit of power, and the co-production of nature are dialectically interpenetrated in an organic and evolving whole. So not three overlapping circles in those well-worn Venn diagrams, because the Venn diagrams still presume an ontological independence. And so what we are saying methodologically, and this is the crucial methodological move, how do we take Raymond Williams' great insight that we are, and human organizations, including capitalism and empires and cities, that these are at once producers and products simultaneously of the web of life? How do we start to ground that? And of course, we have Eric Swingdow in the audience here, who's so greatly advanced our understanding of all of this. I'm not claiming a tremendous novelty here, but the novelty is in grounding this in the world historical patterns of power and production and reproduction in the web of life in the era of capitalist development. And that's been a crucial lacuna in the conversation and in critical geography especially, that there's been a real difficulty in dealing with world historical patterns and a real tendency to treat those as mere context or theoretical constructs rather than real evolving historical geographical patterns. So when we say, of course, that capitalism makes nature and nature makes capitalism, that both flow through each other, shaping each other, we understand, of course, that they are asymmetrical, and that the relations of capitalism and nature and capitalism are always historically specific. Hence, the centrality of historical nature, so that we need to have a conceptualization of nature that is historically specific. It's striking that at a time when no serious political economist would take Marx's concept of nature in general as appropriate to understanding neoliberalism's global transformations of accumulation, financialization, flexible specialization, all of that. You wouldn't use production in nature for any of that. We wouldn't use production in general for any of that. We would use a specific historical conception of how production is organized. And it's striking that today we still have this very powerful hold of nature out there that is very much inscribed in our conceptual vocabulary. And we can talk more about that. Now, in regional political ecology, of course, you all know how to deal with this, which is rich, thick description. That's wonderful. It's entirely appropriate, and I think it's been fairly successful. When the enterprise is understanding how capitalism as a systemic historical process works, or a set or bundle of historical processes work, a different conceptual vocabulary is clearly in order, and you can see the consequences of not adopting this, that you continue to have a very strong dualist frame when we deal with systemic processes. So what we want to do is to emphasize that when we talk about the Capitalocene, and I encounter this all the time, I was going back and forth with the great social theorist Mackenzie Wark, and he says, oh yeah, Jason, what you say about the Capitalocene, that's right, but you have all these hidebound Marxists who say, well, here's capitalism as sort of this independent social sphere over here. And that's really the problem with people talking about the Capitalocene. And so I say, well, you know, if you deal with capitalism as a double internality, you have a very different kind of approach. If you understand that capitalism is both producer and product of the web of life, you have a different set of possibilities. So I think that what we need to return to in order to understand the exhaustion of the capitalist model in organizing the relations between humans and the rest of nature, the exhaustion of that model that began 5 to 6 centuries ago and that is now coming to an end, we need to understand both the exhaustion of its value model that is premised on, as Marx famously tells us, on socially necessary labor time. We need to understand the exhaustion of that model, and also, I'll just tease a bit here, the rise of what I've called, stealing from Phil McMichael and others, the rise of a new ontological politics. Food sovereignty is a great example of this, but also right to the city, climate justice, I think in certain senses degrowth, where the issue delinks the old distributional demands and says distributional demands and the valuation of nature and humans' place within it are all of a piece, that you cannot delink the question of value and the question of equity. And so what I would emphasize is that from the beginning, we have of capitalism, even in the 16th century, and I realize that this goes against the grain of a certain very Anglo-centric, Eurocentric reckoning of the origins of capitalism as having everything to do with the Industrial Revolution. It doesn't. What we see is the rise of a new way of valuing reality that begins from the long 16th century, that it is premised on an extraordinary shift in the history of civilization from land productivity to labor productivity in the dominant patterns of power and production and reproduction. And when we say labor productivity, we mean this in a broader sense than economists talk about it, but fundamentally in terms of an advancing rate of surplus value. And so what we need to understand is that every act of producing surplus value requires a much larger and disproportionate act of appropriating the unpaid work of human and extra-human natures in order to sustain it, for reasons that I will try to make clear over the next little bit. So, of course, capitalism only values what it can count, and while it can measure many things, it can only count really one thing, which is socially necessary labor time. And because the condition of value in this narrow sense is that most work, most purposeful activity, most activity of extra-human nature is by definition devalued. That the condition of some work being valued is that most work is not. So what we want to look at is to understand not a law of value as a mechanical, inexorable, structural force that somehow just decides history in advance. What we want to do is to understand the law of value as something like a gravitational field. This was one of Marx's favorite metaphors of gravity. He constantly returns to this notion. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because that is indeed what we have seen. We have seen more and more of the world sucked into the vortex of socially necessary labor time and the accumulation of capital. But that process is necessarily asymptotic. That is, it cannot continue towards its logical end because of this asymmetry, that the exploitation of labor power in capitalism depends upon the disproportionately larger appropriation of the unpaid work of human and extra-human nature. And by unpaid, I mean reproduced outside the circuit of capital, or largely outside the circuit of capital. Of course, there's a large spectrum of in-between positions, semi-proletarianization, and all the rest. So what we are dealing with is the quantum of human and extra-human nature that reproduces itself outside the circuit of capital. That has obviously been reduced, but is still by much larger than the system, than the accumulation of capital and the flows of capital itself. So what I've tried to do in a series of recent analyses and conversations is if we're going to take this notion of a post-Cartesian social science seriously, we need to understand that the way that capitalism engages the whole of nature in terms of activity is not along a human-extra-human divide. That historically a minor part, and historically even today, a minor part of the smaller part of human population does reproduce itself through the cash the way that capitalism works is by appropriating the unpaid work energy of, in Maria Misa's wonderful phrase, women, nature, and colonies. That's, of course, very stylized, but I think we get the gist of this, that there is a disproportionately larger set of activities, the work of forests, of plate tectonics, of all the living creatures that give us fossil fuels today from millions of years ago, that all of this work is appropriated for free or very low cost. And that is central to the dynamism of the modern world. So instead of a human-extra-human divide, we have a capitalization-appropriation divide. And this allows us to simultaneously understand the centrality of the circuit of capital and the kind of pure capital, the historical implications of a pure capital model, but understanding the value relations are bound up with its necessary conditions of reproduction, which means there is a disproportionately larger set of processes to appropriate by extra economic and especially by mapping and surveying and rationalizing kinds of activities. What Foucault talks about with human populations, but also the whole history of economic botany, botanical imperialism, scientific research, cartographic revolutions, all of that to make the world legible to capital accumulation and to give it the force and legitimacy necessary to do that. So, of course, we have an issue of some work becomes value, and while most work does not, and that means that we need to take seriously this model of capitalization and appropriation as a way out of this old kind of pure capital, and then the Rosa Luxemburg model, and then the Rosa Luxemburg argument, or the Wallerstein argument, or the dependencia argument on the centrality of imperialism and colonialism. I think that not only are those both relevant for political ecology, but I think both of those dominant traditions are irreducibly partial until they learn in some fundamental ways the insights of a broadly defined political ecology. So, the condition of some work being valued, most work is not. So, what we want to do here is to move now from exploitation and appropriation. And by the way, when I think that this concept of the exploitation of nature that is so deeply ingrained in our vocabulary is really a bit of a problem. And some of you might think I'm being a little bit nitpicky when I say this. By the way, I've used this term many times in my own work, so I'm not pointing fingers at anyone other than myself. But that the exploitation of nature is a moral concept. It's not really an analytical one. And that when we understand exploitation, I think it's most fruitful to understand this in terms of the rate of surplus value and the capital-labor relation. And the relations of appropriation are necessarily operate in a way that's very different. And that's not better. That's, in fact, much worse. It's much better to be exploited than to be appropriated by and large. So what we want to try to do here now is to move to the question of cheap nature and to see how can we make sense of the history of the modern world from the standpoint of a deeply political, ecological, or world ecological frame. And again, this is not a kind of closed theorization, but rather an invitation to how do we take seriously some of the decisive motors of power and production and reproduction in world history, and to understand the real limits that are being faced today. I don't think those limits are what are best captured by the phrase natural limits. I think that the limits are limits of capitalism itself, but not from a binaristic frame, from the perspective of the double internality that we have seen, for instance, over the past 4 decades, a remarkable thing, the non-appearance of a new labor productivity revolution, so the progressive stall out of labor productivity growth over the past 4 decades, and oh yeah, by the way, also the progressive stall out of agricultural productivity growth. No new agricultural revolution on the horizon, and in fact, that's going to get much, much worse as climate change advances and meets up with other contradictions of advanced capitalist agriculture, the Green Revolution model. So, the basic argument that I've been trying to advance is that every phase of capitalism, every long wave of capitalist development depends crucially on what I call the four cheaps. Labor power, that is commodified labor power, food, energy, and raw materials. Those must be cheap in value terms. That is the socially necessary labor time embedded in those goes down, but the volume goes up. And this is indeed the history, especially of the labor-food nexus over long historical time, the dispossession of peasantries, the history of agricultural revolutions, every great wave of proletarianization, which, by the way, is something that we need to be studying in political ecology. We need to pick up the ball that was dropped about 30 years ago after Seacombe and Tilley. Every great wave of proletarianization is premised on new supplies of cheap food and also new supplies of cheap energy and raw materials to feed the factories and other sites of production in which they work. So the four cheaps: labor power, food, energy, raw materials. Yes, there's increasing fungibility and flexibility today. We get that, flex crops and all the rest. That's an important part of the story. It's dependent on a new phase of capitalization. It is a weak response to the historic problem of exhaustion, not just soil exhaustion, but the exhaustion of successive agricultural revolutions in the modern world. If you can create more flexibility, more fungibility, more acceleration, you can, to some degree, overcome the effects of slowing productivity. And of course, we live in an era of the fifth cheap in an unprecedented way. Historically low rates of interest. That's why oil prices are at a surprising low point, despite no new cheap production zones being brought online. And we can talk more about that later. So what I would say is that all of these new developments, every phase of capitalism, every great era of modern world history has a new imperialism, a new agricultural revolution, a new scientific revolution. All of these need to be understood as bundles of human and extra-human nature, and that these are both material and symbolic. I'm very disturbed by a certain tendency that's even on the left in global environmental change studies that somehow trumpets this notion of materiality as if that's somehow more decisive at every turn. Now, I'm a Marxist like all the rest, but what did Marx say? Yes, even ideas become a material force at certain crucial historical moments. This is certainly the history of scientific revolutions that are wrapped up with transformations of dispossession and agricultural productivity advances. So why is this so important? Well, because in capitalism, the costs of production are always rising. And that's why you can't have a steady state condition. And that's why the slowdown of labor productivity growth, the real basis of capital accumulation, is a real problem. That's why the slowdown of agricultural productivity growth as well is a pronounced problem. So what we've seen recurrently are revolutions that reduce the cost of producing the definitive mass commodities, say sugar in the early modern era or autos in the 20th century, reduce the reproduction costs of labor power through new agricultural revolutions, increase labor productivity, and expand the material volume of production at itself. And one of the big sort of errors, I think, or confusions that we've had both in political economy and political ecology is that the overaccumulation problem, that is the generation of capital that cannot be profitably invested at or above the average rate of profit, the overaccumulation problem is not only a problem of overproduction. The achievement of so-called fossil capitalism was to banish or to demote the significance of what Marx calls underproduction problems. Now, I don't mean underproduction in a Malthusian sense, but in Marx's sense. For Marx, his general law of underproduction, that's his term, that the great industrial dynamism, and I would extend this to agriculture as well, the great industrial dynamism of capitalism tends necessarily to lead to a problem in supplying inputs and what he called circulating capital, not the circulation of capital, not in that sense, but the two moments of constant capital, not just machinery, but raw materials. Raw materials, the circulating capital. And that's really the forgotten moment of Marx's political economy, even up to this day. So instead of Marx's general law of underproduction, we have the Jevons paradox, which is a very illuminating concept, but it's a very neoclassical concept. It's all about price movements. And so one of the curious things that we've seen is Marx is celebrating something like the Jevons paradox, a very neoclassical notion, and somehow ignoring Marx's general law of underproduction. And I think what we're poised to see, and there are powerful signs of this both in metals, in energy, and in food production, we're seeing that the terrain is very ripe for a reassertion of underproduction crises. That is, crises of the main inputs becoming too expensive. And so while it is relative, it's not that capitalism probably can't survive on $200 a barrel oil. And we can talk more about why that or something in that direction is useful to think about. All right, so what I want to put forward here in the second half of the talk or so is 3 models and then 3 histories. So model 1 is making this shift from what capitalism does to nature to how does capitalism put nature to work. And by nature, I include human nature as well. I think that this is crucial because I think that the capacity, capitalism's capacity to put nature to work in a way that reduces the prices of production and raises the rate of accumulation is becoming weaker and weaker. And what I would point to is that for all the talk of early capitalism, that is capitalism between 1450 and 1750, being not real capitalism, merchant capitalism, pre-industrial capitalism, all of that is bogus. Anyone who looks at the early history of capitalism will see the most audacious reinvention of a civilization's relation to environment making that had ever been seen in human history aside from the Neolithic Revolution. That what we saw was a quantum leap in the scale, scope, and speed of environmental change between 1450 and 1750. I'll run through some of the crucial facts of this in a few moments. And that this was prodigiously industrial in many senses of the word, and that used nature as a force of production to advance what? To advance labor productivity within commodity production and exchange. So that was what we saw. We saw a global and recurrently advancing set of commodity frontiers across early capitalism, but of course they continue to this day, even if the commodity frontiers are no longer significant. So the essence of a commodity frontier, however, is not the advance of commodity production and exchange in itself. It is the advance of commodity production and exchange in relation to a much larger set of appropriations of unpaid work of human and extra-human nature. So the sugar frontier is a great example of this, that African slaves and the forests and soils of the Americas were put to work to advance labor productivity within commodity production. And sugar was one of the decisive mass commodities of that era. You could tell similar stories about other later agricultural and primary sector frontiers. So cheap labor is this strategy that avoids mechanization where possible, but also makes possible prodigious mechanization. So where do we often see the most precocious forms of industrialization? We often see them historically in those places where nature is cheapest. So where do we get the steam engine, the origins of the steam engine? Somebody want to tell me? Where's the steam engine invented? Right at the pits, right? Okay, so right at the mine pits. So where nature, where the coal is absolutely cheapest to suck the water out of the mine pits. That you have And this is the history of agricultural industrialization, which goes back to sugar as ever. But we can, and mining as well, that if you looked at the great mines of Potosi or the sugar plantations of Bahia in the early 17th century, you would see the most industrial and mechanized places in the world. But the genius was that the volume of fixed capital relative to appropriation was relatively minimal. Okay, so the second model is what I've already introduced, Marx's general law of underproduction. So capitalism's technological dynamism tends to outrun its capacity to deliver cheap natures. And that underproduction was dominant. The key problem of early capitalism was not a consumer problem, but that is not enough consumers to buy the commodities, but rather how do you get the cheap resources to the factory gates. That does appear to be coming back today. And you can see this in part by the rather odd so-called end to the modern world's longest commodity boom, which is supposedly over, but in fact prices for most major commodities remain very high. Oil remains at an average that is significantly higher still than the prices of 20 years ago. So we have a dynamic of underproduction that I think we need to deal with very seriously, and that we need to deal with in a relational and, I would say, Marxist way, because otherwise we cede the terrain to the neo-Malthusians and even the left-wing neo-Malthusians. So I think that this issue of scarcity needs to be dealt with, but in a much different way than the neo-Malthusians would have it. And we need to understand that the most basic problem of political economy, the surplus capital problem, is fundamentally a problem of cheap nature. How historically have the great overaccumulations of capital been resolved? Well, they've been resolved through audacious frontier movements that bring down the price of energy, labor, raw materials, and food. The auto revolution is a great example. What is the automobilization of the 20th century based on? Well, it's based on cheap oil, cheap steel, cheap rubber, so on and so forth. Of course, rubber became synthetic very fast. And you can look at this in the 19th century with the railroad revolution. What were the railroads being built to? Well, they were being built to places that were going to deliver cheap labor and food and energy and raw materials to the sites of commodity production and exchange. So the location of new sources, these epical inventions that have continually remade historical capitalism and resolved the problem of overaccumulation, these are fundamentally socio-ecological. And so in that sense, I think we can have a socio-ecological reinvention of the Schumpeterian Marxist position of, say, Baran and Sweezy or Arrighi. All right, so now I'm gonna whip through all too fast three stories. The first story is going to be about the rise of capitalism. The second story is going to be about the turning point of the Industrial Revolution. And the third story is going to be about the neoliberal era. So what I would emphasize is that in the period 1450 to 1750, we see in the patterns of environment making, even if you wanted to stay within a dualist frame, in environment making, we saw the scale, scope, and speed. The moment of speed is very crucial, of environment making change often by an order of magnitude what we had seen before. So yes, the Chinese built the Great Wall, but they didn't do it in decades. And they didn't then go and build great walls all over the world, which of course is one of the storylines of neoliberalism, right? Let's build more walls. That's all we need. This is my favorite stylized fact. In medieval Picardy in northeastern France, it took 200 years to clear 12,000 hectares of forest. 4 centuries later, in northeastern Brazil, in Bahia, it took 1 year to clear 12,000 hectares of forest. So that's not 1, but 2 orders of magnitude. And that is a pronounced but not exceptional example of what we find in this era. That this is an era where we see the productivist view and praxis of nature come into full flower. And that is what made the era of the Industrial Revolution and the so-called Anthropocene so dynamic. It was the relations and the vistas of cheap nature that were developed over the course of these centuries. That we have three key movements and moments. Earth-moving, mechanization, and then a whole series of revolutions in knowledge production and symbolic praxis. And so with Lewis Mumford, I think one of the forgotten great political ecologists and Marxists of the 20th century, I would say that we need to make the shift from technology to technics, to bring together tools and power and knowledge as an evolving whole in the concept of technics, and to see technics, new technics, and new historical natures, and new ways of accumulation as all feeding off each other. And so the rise of capitalism is not only a revolution in the role of commodity production and exchange. Of course, commodity production wasn't new. But we saw a new relationship between commodity production and exchange and state power, forms of knowledge production, and, of course, the world market. And that simultaneous and really imminent to all of these shifts was a revolution in ways of seeing and ways of knowing. I think geographers have been really great about this in charting the cartographic revolution, revolutions in property making and surveying. Of course, there are about 2 million English studies of how that worked in the countryside there, but it was a global process, a process at least within capitalism. And that what we saw during this era were, three of the tenets that are still with us very much today in how the world works. A view of nature as external, space is flat, time is linear. And this was what underpinned the dramatic transformations of the centuries since then. So I'm not going to tick through all of these, but simply to highlight a few of the key examples. First of all, we saw a rolling series of agricultural revolutions that began in northwestern Europe. In one sense, kind of a metropolitan, if you will, moment of agricultural revolutions. Agricultural revolutions in the sense of rising labor productivity in agriculture and the expulsion of peasants from the land, first in the Low Countries, then in England, but tied decisively to colonial agricultural revolution. So the rise of the Dutch to world superpower status was linked to the transformation not only of northeastern Brazil, but also of Poland as a colonial zone. And that history would continue across the history of the modern world. That we saw a series of industrial and extractivist revolutions in mining and metal production roll out. We saw sugar revolutions in a pace. The reason why I give you this is because we've never seen this kind of thing in human history, where you have 50 to 60 year cycles. One region after the other comes to the top of the heap. This has been continuing ever since. And you have this restless geography and this acceleration of socio-ecological change. Felipe and I were talking about this in Brazil, what he's seen in Brazil over the past couple of years when we were talking last night. It's that same pattern. You would never have seen this. Cyprus is a medieval phenomenon. Once you get to the modern era, you have a kind of time-space compression as it manifests in the production of nature. And that everything starts to move faster. That this applies crucially to sources of human labor, not only the African slaving frontiers, but also the phenomena of what was called proto-industrialization within Europe, and the impressment of women's work, especially to women's labor power to produce, to spin and produce cloth around the demands both of the intergenerational reproduction around caring for children and also around the agricultural cycle. This was an expansionary movement in the sense that it kept moving, moving, moving. It was not purely a colonial moment. One of the problems with how we've come to understand the environmental history of the modern world is that we've come to focus on the colonial moment as if it was the nasty European imperialists, and okay, they were nasty, and they were European, and they were imperialists, and they did terrible things, but guess what? You can see the same patterns in Brazil and in Poland and in the Baltic. There were these restless commodity frontiers moving all the way through, and that they were synchronic, that the deforestation of the Vistula Basin in Poland and the Bahia de Aconcagua are going on at the same time, are the greatest episodes of deforestation in a very compressed time frame, about 50 to 80 years, that we had ever seen in human history, no thanks to fossil fuels. So, and oh yeah, if we want to talk about fossil fuels, let's remember that that revolution in England begins in the 1530s and not somehow in 1712. And finally, of course, the Columbian Exchange, which was not simply a passive exchange of flora and fauna, but was very much actively co-produced. So we have the story of the Industrial Revolution, which needs to be dealt with. I still am amazed that we have no really compelling political ecological account of the Industrial Revolution. Andreas Malm's new book with Verso in the fall will partially rectify that, although unfortunately from a very Anglo-centric frame that I think vitiates some of its major findings. But that's an important conversation to be had. How do we understand this era of the Industrial Revolution? Because it's really the lodestar of modern social theory, and it's based on a mythology that is deeply problematic and does not necessarily accord with the reality of historical geographical change in this era. So over this period, though, we see, I would say, the elements of a new approach would emphasize the new extractivisms. So not just coal, but let's remember that in the United States, charcoal was the principal energy source until 1870. Coal didn't displace charcoal until 1870. Of course, in English industry, steam power doesn't win the day over water until the 1830s. You have new agricultural revolutions, the rise of the United States. One of the reasons for America's fascinating history is that it was so gigantic that multiple agricultural and extractive revolutions could occur, as in the simultaneous revolutions of the American South and the American Midwest. And that you saw new working classes created, the second slavery, the resurgence of slavery in the early 19th century, but also the dispossession of peasants in successive eras across this period of dispossessions and colonialism, all of that. That what we are seeing are, in this era of the 18th century, and by the way, the middle of the 18th century kicked off a massive agrarian crisis. The great concern of Ricardo and Malthus, if we recall, was that rising food prices would throttle industrialization. And indeed, the industrial price index rises, or the agricultural price index in England rises 4 times faster than the industrial price index, a phenomenon repeated across the European world economy at the time. So what we are looking at in this era of neoliberalism is, I think, a new phase at which some combination of the 4 chiefs had to be put together, of labor, power, food, energy, and raw materials. That is indeed what we saw, that between 75 and 89, you have falling commodity prices for metals by about half. Food commodity prices decline very sharply. Oil stabilizes at about twice the post-war period. Of course, as we know, labor costs were dramatically reduced and imposed widespread wage repression across the North. And that succeeded in restabilizing capital accumulation, restoring the rate of profit by 1983. It was always tenuous, and that's one of the reasons for the great financialization that occurred, because the capacity to revive accumulation was much weaker, because the capacity to assemble a critical mass of the 4 chiefs was much weaker than ever before. And so what I would say is that we have a whole series of transformations in neoliberalism, taken as a phase of capitalism, by the way. I think that there's a whole great literature on neoliberalization as a set of policy initiatives, and I want to bracket those, and we can tease that out if we like. But what I would emphasize here is that we see a series of essentially one-shot deals. That's the essence of commodity frontier theory, that we have rolling commodity frontiers because every commodity frontier, every act of restoring cheap labor or cheap food, energy, raw materials depends on specific historical geographical conditions that are quickly and rapidly exhausted. There are not going to be another 200 to 300 million Chinese peasants pushed off the land. They're going to try. But they're not going to push off the land. There's been, and as we become very familiar with, not only rising labor unrest, but also sharply rising wages in the new workshop of the world. This despite the great doubling, Richard Freeman, the Harvard economist phrase, the great doubling of the world labor force, which was premised on another one-shot deal, the tremendous expansion of the female proletariat on a world scale. And that this was an unprecedented global expansion of what Arlie Hochschild calls the second shift, the second and third shift. And of course, this is, and then of course there was also a dramatic reduction in the consumption of billions across the global south. We estimate about 3 billion people experience micronutrient deficiencies. If you take the FAO's more expanded version definition of hunger, you have about 2.5 billion people. That gives us a much different sense of what's going on today. Yes, there are plenty of people who could potentially work for very low wages, but what we've seen over the past decade is reducing a faltering grip of capital's ability to suppress wages, and more importantly, to suppress reproduction costs across the global north. So you see the rising costs of social reproduction measured in government spending share of GDP across the global north. In the United States, 37% of the economy is government spending. So what I think we're looking at are a series of profound erosions that are going on right now around these four chiefs. Oil, I mean, I think oil is the crucial example. People always say I'm making a peak oil argument when I say this. I don't think this is necessarily the case, because the essence of a peak oil approach, and I think there's a kernel of truth to that, is it's getting harder geologically to extract and technically to extract the oil from the ground. But if you look at what's happened to capital expenditures in the independent oil companies, what you're seeing is a dramatic decline of new capital expenditures capacity to produce a barrel of oil. How dramatic a decline? 90%. A 90% decline. So, in other words, you would lay down $1 in 1980 through the 80s and 90s. You would lay down $1 of new capital expenditure and say get 1 barrel. Today, you lay down $1 in capital expenditure, you get 1/10 of a barrel. Never mind that all the new oil is tight oil, is very expensive oil, and the cash flow neutral point for about 80% of the world's independent oil companies is $100 or higher. So the era of $60 a barrel oil is coming to an end. And by the way, $60 a barrel is not sufficient to revive accumulation. It would have to go down much, much further. And to be sustainable, it would have to rest on new, cheap production sites. Labor costs, as I mentioned, are going up very rapidly. 300% in China between 90 and 2005. Yeah, we're seeing runaway factories, so they go to Cambodia, but Cambodia is really small, and the labor organizers are able to respond much faster than ever before. Metals as well. We're seeing rising production costs across the board in the major industrial metal production. And food, cheap food is done. Absolutely done. It is not coming back. There is going to be no productivist revolution. How do we know? Because we've already lived through 3 decades of efforts to launch a new productivist revolution in agriculture. The slowdown in world agricultural productivity through various measures is very pronounced. It's very obvious. It's been going on for varied regions, but between 2 and 3 decades. And climate change is going to so fundamentally destabilize cheap food that modernity as we have known it is over. Now, it might not be better. I'm not saying that because capitalism is premised on cheap food and cheap nature that its end will bring something better, but, you know, there's a possibility for alternatives. So what I would say is that we also have, in addition to the continuing failure of the GMO revolution, the new productivist strategies to restore cheap nature, and the ongoing contradictions of climate change, we also have the issues of food justice, food sovereignty, not as the only key examples, but as expressive. And the key insight, I think, of food sovereignty is to say, well, we have the question of nature, the question of equality, and the question of cultural determination that cannot be separated from each other. And yes, those kinds of arguments were made a century ago, but today they assume a new centrality, and I think that they're coming up in the movements in a much more fluid way than ever before. So what does all this mean for the question of limits? First of all, no such thing as natural limits and social limits. Let's get rid of that. Because we understand that humans are always a part of nature, and the organizations that we build, families and empires and world markets, are always already part of nature. Okay, so we need to reorient our methods to look at the specific configurations of human and extra-human natures. And to do this in multiple scales and multiple dimensions of historical change. That means that nature is not external, its energies are not somehow mysteriously drawn down. Yes, there is dissipation, there is entropy. This is not a sort of some weird constructivist argument. In fact, what I would say is the approach that I'm outlining accentuates the real historical impact of entropic processes of various sorts, of depletion in various sorts. I think that the dualist model understates the significance of the role of depletion. And I would say that I mean, this is a very elementary point, but that all nature is historically specific, and that we need to get very serious about understanding how specific eras of capitalist development both are produced and are produced by specific historical natures. That capitalism doesn't simply act upon nature, although that's its conceit. The governing conceit of capitalism is that nature is out there and humans are in here. And by the way, nature is out there included a lot of humanity. I mean, the great debates over who gets to count as human and not human around gender and race are forged on that boundary-setting struggle. And that in terms of our political ecology, what we're looking at are these simultaneous and mutual relational movements of capitalization, the pure model of capital accumulation taken as a heuristic, and its relation to the broader relations of reproduction of capital. And that brings into question colonialism and empires and power and territoriality and all those things that critical geographers have been so great at illuminating. So the ongoing erosion of cheap nature, the big question is this a cyclical development or is it an epochal shift? Obviously, my position is that this is potentially an epochal shift because the frontiers of appropriation, the new sources of labor power, of food, of energy, of raw materials, are no longer there. Now, again, this is not a reductive list, so we can introduce other cheaps, other elements. We can introduce money, we can introduce water, we can introduce many other elements. But what I'm trying to do is to sort of reset a new political economy, political ecology synthesis that allows for a new set of conversations across this divide in hopefully a productive way. So I think that the movements are already well ahead of anything that I can say. But what I've tried to say is that some of the most exciting movements in the world today are not necessarily, they're not defined by who's dealing with the question of environment and who's not, but who is dealing with the questions of social reproduction in the broadest possible sense of that term, which of course is far more than merely social. That is in education, in access to water, in access to food, in all of these as more than simply distributional demands, but as representatives of a new, perhaps weakly formulated, but a new ontological politics. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot more. Sorry, I feel a little bit beaten up by your talk, so probably my question will be a little bit naive. Indeed, the first one is related to your point about peak oil, because the end of cheap oil, I have heard about it, above all from people from energetic studies, EROI and so on and so forth, so from peak oil position. So how it really differ? Because you say, no, there is no relation with that. At least in your slides, I understood it in this way. So why there is no relation between the argumentation of peak oil and your argumentation about the end of cheap oil? And the second one is related, how will fit the reasoning of Polanyi about the double movement in your cycle, like to describe a little bit the clashes, because the four categories are basically what will be like fictitious commodities, so resistant to capital advancement. This is.
Thanks, those are great questions. So your question about oil is about the relation of debt, or?
Yeah, the first is, you said it's not about peak oil, but so my question is,
well, peak oil
you don't see any relation, or that the peak oil, let's say, explanation of the end of cheap oil, say something but too little in terms of what you are trying to say?
Well, I think there's an important, I mean, of course, this category is enormously problematic and people mean different things by it. I think the rational kernel of peak oil arguments is that it is becoming more and more expensive to extract the oil, and indeed it is. So that's very important. Now, what's also going on, because the neoliberal era as a whole, and recently the U.S. Federal Reserve has signaled that it will raise interest rates, but has not done so yet, is that in the U.S., tight oil production is underwritten by very low interest rates. And so the mid-sized producers are heavily indebted and continuing to pump oil. That's how we end up with $60 a barrel oil, or thereabouts. So cheap money is another, there are perhaps 5 cheaps, but cheap money is a different animal altogether. We need to understand money in political ecology a lot better than we do as well. So that's what I would say about oil. So I wouldn't say no relation. Definitely a relation between the costs of extraction, debt, and not just debt, but the cash flow neutral position, not the break-even position that's cited in the media, but the cash flow neutral position of independent oil companies is quite important to what's going on. I think it's a very unstable movement. Polanyi, look, I know Polanyi's a big political ecology hero. I worry that often there's a kind of, it introduces a kind of metaphysic, and that we're waiting for the double movement. I think the core of Polanyi's argument is, of course, right in what I've said, that there is a continual undermining of the conditions of production, including money. So I think Polanyi can be put into conversation in useful ways. But I also think a little bit of Polanyi goes a really long way.
Thanks, Jason, for this presentation. Very thoughtful and very insightful. I have a question about a point that you mentioned earlier in your presentation about this Harvey-Foster linkage, because I mean, there is quite a deal of disagreement between their approaches, I think, to Marx and how it positions itself. But if there is one thing that they definitely agree on is the Podolsky business, I mean, entropy, which they strictly kind of sideline and do not really agree. A couple of weeks ago, David Harvey was here in Istanbul, and in his speech, actually, someone from the audience also asked him about his views on entropy, and he clearly said that he was involved in some debates on entropy, and he doesn't see it relevant in this context. So I was wondering, how do you actually position your capitalism as world ecology argument vis-a-vis this Podolinsky business, so the entropy and so on and so forth? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great question. I mean, certainly there are broadly defined entropic processes within capitalism, and the frontier expansion has been the chief way of equilibrating, of offsetting the tendency of rising entropy, manifested in rising costs of production. I mean, these are very crude categories at this level. I think that sometimes a reservation, and I don't know what David's position is on this these days, but I think sometimes the worry is that it too becomes a kind of metaphysic. So in the work of Elmar Altfather, whose work I've been enormously influenced by, there's often a sense of, these sort of eternal entropic processes that ultimately wind down capitalism. And I think that entropy has to be taken as much more of a methodological proposition to understand the relations of humans and the rest of nature than as an iron law. And I worry that sometimes these concepts are very much taken as kinds of iron laws or positivist formulations. You see this with the Foster tradition of metabolic rift, which has become a positivist, I'm sorry to say, it's become a positivist formulation. Here's the axiom, and then look, we're going to go out and show how that operates, how that manifests in the world. So I think, like anything, you can take entropy, you can use entropy well or poorly. And I take up the question of entropy just a bit in the Web of Life book. We can't discount it, and we need to look. Robert Beale is very good at looking at entropic processes and imperialism, I thought. I'm not sure how much that's been followed up on, maybe more than I'm aware of. So I'm very much open to that conversation.
Thank you, Jason. That was fantastic. I have a question also about cheap nature. Because while you were talking, I kept on asking myself, cheap to whom or to what? Of course, nature is not paid. But that I mean, of course, that the payment goes to a socially embodied agent and not to some non-human agent. And in that sense, cheap may refer to two things, I think. On the one hand, the process to make nature usable in some sort of way within the metabolic circulation of capital, and that has to do with the productivity of labor, the conditions of nature, etc. So that's one way of thinking of cheap. The other way of thinking of cheap or expensive is to whom the payment for the use of that nature goes. We used to call that the landowner, but this is the kind of wide strata of those who own and therefore control in a monopoly manner access to nature, historical nature, etc. Now, historically speaking, capital didn't have to worry much about that, in the sense that it looted dispossessed people. It got it free, basically, through all the violent mechanisms of imperialism and colonialism that we know. These days, this is much more difficult, because with the spread of capitalism, you had the much better entrenchment of property rights, property laws, etc., which means that increasingly the owners of nature in their class position with respect to industrial or other forms of capital have become much more powerful. We clearly see that in the urban environment. So is it not the case that the end of cheap nature may have to do with the deepening of capitalist ownership relationships, which put those who own, in a property sense, nature, have a much greater force in fighting for part of the surplus, what we used to call rent, but which now can be extended to all manner of natures through the deepening of of these property relationships. And therefore my question ultimately is, shouldn't we be a bit more careful to the class struggles, the variety of inter and intra-class struggles that animate the historical ecological dynamic of capitalism? And I felt that you didn't say much about that, but ultimately I think that the end of cheap nature has to do with increasing payments to those who own, control.
It reintroduces with a new salience the question of rent and the class struggles around that. Absolutely. I think that's one of the key elements of any new research agenda that we need to pursue very, very seriously. So all I can say is, yes, I emphatically agree.
Jackson, how do you integrate in your analysis the use values of nature? If you analyze the contradiction between value and the use values, and what opinion do you have about the social decisions about not to produce, not to extract, or keep oil or mining in the soil? And definitely these kind of proposals are a way to think nature in a different way. But my question is if you consider these strategies as a real emancipatory way to take the nature out of commodifications. Mm-hmm. If there is a possibility through the not to use something to give nature or to keep nature
or to use
outside the market.
Yeah, or to use it differently.
Or to use it different, yeah. Or to give again the society the capacity to decide about the use natures. I really like to know if you use this category, how do you understand, how do you use into your theoretical analysis?
Well, first of all, that's a great question, and I think that struggle around decommodification, which has been part of the movement landscape and sensibility really since the 70s, but I think it's taking on new importance. I think that is absolutely crucial in the world today. I think that the most revolutionary struggles are those that seek to roll back commodification. Now, there are qualifications that can be made about that, I understand. This category of use value, I worry that it is often misused. That we often talk about use values as if they have an eternal existence. But for Marx, the category of use value is bound to what? The category of value. So value and use value were dialectic, they were historically determinate concepts for Marx, not general concepts. And part of what's happened, certainly in Marxist environmental sociology, but in other fields as well, there's been a talk about nature as if it's a warehouse of use values, which is a very modernist and I think quasi-Malthusian proposition. So that, of course, the web of life can do many things for humans, and humans can do many things for it. But I think the crucial issues are, that you seem to point to, are questions of market rule over a democratic determination of how do we relate to the rest of nature. And I think that if we can, I think that in that sense the movements are very far ahead of where we're at in many respects, and I think we have a lot to learn from that. So that's what I would say about that. And I would also say we need to be careful about this category of use value, because it's often just used like, you know, the Iroquois had a use value based mode of production, which I don't think is true. I think they had a mode of production, but I don't think use value is necessarily all that productive, aside from a very general statement of nature in general, perhaps.
Thank you for your great speech. My question is about food. You said cheap food is over, but I agree with you on about raw food and how we raw food. But when we look at processed food, I don't think it's. Do you see somewhere in the future processed food getting cheaper? And you know what I mean by processed foods, because it's especially when you look at the United States, raw food and food to eat is actually much more expensive than processed foods, which is actually the main problem with nutrition and the health crisis that they have over there, which is actually spreading to the world. So that's why I was wondering your views on how you see it reflect on processed foods. Thank you.
Well, that's a fantastic question. Yes, the food from nowhere, kind of the cornification of everything, right? But if you look at what's going on with the world's 4 main cereal crops, even soy, which is the neoliberal industrial food crop, you have declining rates of productivity growth. Labor productivity is growing somewhat faster than yield growth, but not by a lot. And the curve is generally a slowing of that rate of growth over time, sometimes very, very sharply. So that's the real basis of cheap food. And every great wave of proletarianization, of bringing peasants into the global world, into the global labor market, has been premised on these great agricultural productivity revolutions. And as we've seen from the research now on GMOs, basically zero improvement in yield. Sometimes short-run improvements over that period, 6 to 10 years, but then rising costs and stagnant yields, just like before or worse. And then you add on top of that climate change, which is already suppressing yield growth, and couple that with the water question, huge all over the world. You look at California. If California goes under as a major agricultural producer, you're going to have massive problems in just equilibrating that within a capitalist model. So. Yeah, I don't see industrial food has been the model that's tried to deal with the decline of agricultural productivity and the non-appearance of a new green revolution. So I don't see it returning. And of course, the poorer you are, the more you spend on food, including in the United States. And in the United States, average household spending on food is very, very low, but for the poor, it's twice as much as it is for the so-called middle class, which itself is being compressed, as we know. So the question of wage repression and not just industrial, but urban worker organizing and food are so tightly interlinked. Of course, not just in North America and China and many other places, probably here as well.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. 2 questions a bit related to each other. The first one is, you said a couple of times that the social movements are ahead of us, if that's the correct form. I want you to elaborate a bit on that. And this comes to the second question, which is more strategic, both on political but also on scientific, analytical grounds. I'm wondering if we can talk nowadays, or if it's needed to talk about geographies in plural as ecologies, natures. So what I'm trying to say is, if you think there are at the moment attempts to create or to experience all these new ecologies, new geographies that are competitive to capitalism at the moment, to this totality.
Well, my colleagues always accuse me of being more optimistic than is warranted, so let me confess to that first. But I take a lot of inspiration from a broadly defined food sovereignty movement. I'm not romantic about it. I share many of Henry Bernstein's skeptical notes about food sovereignty. At the same time, I think that food sovereignty is expressive of a broader set of movements that say the question of nature, of distribution of cultural determinism and equality are all of a piece. They're all one. And so this is a break with the old productivist view of nature, taken up even by the Bolivarian socialism or the projects of Ecuador or Bolivia, which talk about socialism in some sense, but then retain a very productivist, modernist view of nature. And I think those two are incompatible. And I think that's what food sovereignty, climate justice, and a number of other movements are saying, that there has to be a way of, if you're going to deal with one of the questions, you have to deal with them all. Are those alternatives to capitalism right now? It depends what you mean by alternative. What I would say is that history is full of surprises, and that I am much less convinced than many of my Marxist colleagues about the resilience of capitalism. I don't think capitalism today is resilient at all. I think it's profoundly unstable, and I think that the lesson of financialization studies is that we are in an era of unprecedented instability, and the financialization has not resolved the underlying overaccumulation problem. It has tried to do so, and we've seen it with land grabs, we've seen it with all manner of dispossessions, we've seen it with privatization, we've seen it with everything over the past 30 years, and it has not recreated a stable basis for a new golden age of capitalism, or even a copper age of capitalism, if you will. So I don't see a protracted period of capital accumulation coming back. So I think the question of alternatives needs to be raised very seriously. And I think here I would also note that I think the arguments of somebody like Christian Parenti are very important, that we need to take the role of the state and of state power to deal with climate and other problems very seriously. And the dominance of certain kinds of anarchist thinking have maybe disabled us in that respect. So the old left questions are not completely wrong. We just need to reframe them in some fundamental ways. So I would add that.
Thank you, Jason. I wanted to ask a question about two main processes that you identify and we identify as political ecologists, and I'm trying to figure out whether they are contradictory or complementary. So on the one hand, so we have appropriation of cheap natures, labor, female work, etc. On the other hand, we have the commodification of unpaid services, like of, again, women work, nature, etc. And we say that capitalism has the tendency to do both, but on the face of it, they are contradictory, no? Like, if you are to pay for nature, if you are to pay for ecosystem services, then the costs of production are rising. So how do we see these two related?
Well, that's a fantastic question, Jorgis. And that's one that I wrestled with for a long time when I was working on this book. So the question is, you have this pure model of accumulation, which has a certain explanatory power, especially when we're looking at the centers of advanced capitalism. And then we have the reality of various forms of care work, of unpaid work, of ecosystem services, as you point out. In a weird sense, I think that ecosystem services, even though it's a very neoliberal discourse, it's a kind of revolutionary challenge to capitalism. Because if capitalism were ever to pay for ecosystem services, nobody would be able to make a profit. And the same thing could be said, of course, for care work. So they are contradictory, but in a dialectical sense. They are mutually formative and mutually exhausting. So there's always that movement for a kind of a commodity frontier movement in Arlie Hochschild's sense of commodifying care work, of commodifying, say, home cooking, for instance, through the fast food revolution. There's always that moment, and that moment works. Here is the importance of history. That moment works for a time because it does introduce new efficiencies, and does introduce new possibilities for labor productivity over the middle run, usually of about a generation. So the fast food revolution and women's proletarianization in a place like the United States did indeed prove very effective at stabilizing or even reducing labor costs in the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s. But it's not having the same effect today. So you can't simply endlessly repeat itself. And this is a lot of what I get from, so I think that's exactly right, that what capitalists are always trying to do is to get cheap labor, food, energy, raw materials, and that one way to do that over the short run is to commodify them. And we've seen a fair bit of that in the neoliberal era. But it only works for a definite period of time, and you can't simply go back and rob that gas station again and again and again and again. At some point, the fruits of that enterprise confront dramatically declining returns. And that sets in motion new appropriations and new capitalizations. At some point, though, you can't do that very effectively, and I think that we've reached that point. I might be proven wrong, but I don't see a new era of sustained accumulation coming out of the Chinese model. I don't see any effective capitalist strategies to deal with climate change, which is going to fundamentally undermine a whole series of these issues relating to reproduction costs, both the reproduction costs of extra-human nature or of human labor power. So, yes, they are contradictory in a dialectical sense. They do cancel each other out, but they also form each other at one period of time. So dialectics is often misused. Dialectics always refers to a historical process. So it's dialectical in that sense and contradictory in that sense. Yeah. It's a great question.
Hi. Really great presentation. Thank you for the very thorough and rapid pace tour of the world. That was an incredible tour de force. And I wanted to just also thank you for bringing up so many different textures, whether it's about valuation of nature, payment for ecosystem services, kind of being under the radar, but you're just kind of bringing that up, talking more ecological economics wise, but also looking at the complexities of the Capitalocene, kind of building on Andreas Malm's ideas with that. It's great to see you pulling that to the fore, and also looking at some of the work he's been doing on fossil
Now,
capital.
he doesn't use this term.
Capitalocene. Oh,
he came up with the term in 29. He said, "Fuck the Anthropocene. It's the Capitalocene."
Exactly.
But he doesn't want to engage. I finally got him to engage it in a book that I have him in. Yeah, he's in fact been very reluctant to have a theory of the Capitalocene. So
yeah,
sorry to jump in there.
No, that's quite all right. You're right, and because since 2009 he hasn't really been engaging as much. But it's great to see you kind of bringing it back. That maybe one of my questions is to what extent you wanted to sort of build on perhaps the Capitalocene being something a different discourse from Anthropocene, being that it seems to be looking at different start dates that are more 1450 than looking at what's happening in the discussions now from the geological epoch, kind of looking at the work that Andreas has been writing on with Alf Hohenberg. With the Geology of Mankind that came out in 2014. So looking at the sort of false Anthropocene debate, trying to actually start to attribute responsibility and say that this isn't just a general thing that happened since man started having fire. So that's sort of one of those questions. You are well founded in where I was going with that. One of my questions was to what extent you'd like to sort of tease out the Capitalocene aspect as something separate from Anthropocene, looking at the kind of attribution of responsibility that comes in those different discourses. And when you're looking at climate change as being a pivot marker for Anthropocene discussions, the great acceleration from 1950 onwards is something Will Steffen and some of the others at Stockholm Resilience Center and others are looking into because of the clear hockey stick marker in the emissions.
The golden spike and all that.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. And so the other thing I wanted to ask you about, the second part of my question was looking at, I'm glad, I feel that we caught you at the end of a really incredible presentation where you were able to bring up something you were calling anti-systemic movements. And I wanted to ask if you meant really, you were talking about anti-capitalist movements, because some of the other movements I think you're alluding to have systemic aspects, but they are alternative systemics. Looking at so that you don't sort of reify capitalism as a you know, something that's the baseline of normal, and to kind of create a discussion around that. If you're looking at ways of intertwining some of the things that were brought up about rentier equality discourses that are looking at to who is responsible and sort of putting a name on the owners and the capital accumulation beneficiaries and those who are benefiting from those dispossessions that you've alluded to. So just looking to see if we can get some clarification on that so that we can understand to what extent we wanted to avoid the reification of capitalism as a norm. Thank you.
Well, magnificent questions. So thank you. Those are awesome questions. I think I have the least to say about the second part of your question. Anti-systemic movements, I simply borrow from Hopkins and Wallerstein and Arrighi as a broad catch-all category. I think you're absolutely right to make that distinction. Probably alter globalization, or it sounds better in French, but something to advance a different model, movements for commoning and reclaiming urban public space and essentially reasserting the commons against the rule of the commodity system. I think, yes, those are to be encouraged. And I think that the kind of argument that I'm advancing is helpful because it reorients us to questions of power and production and reproduction rather than nature or the climate as the thing to protect or conserve or save, which is still very, very popular. That, well, we need to protect the environment. And I'm not sure that that's the best way to go about actually doing the things that many people who say that would like to do. Around Anthropocene and Capitalocene, Capitalocene is useful for aesthetic reasons, even though it's a really ugly word. I like to say it's an ugly word for an ugly system. It doesn't deserve a pretty name. So that's my argument, that I very rarely use the term, but it's so useful because the Anthropocene has taken on this, it's become an elevator concept, you know, that people have a sense of what that means. And of course, that's the problem. I mean, where do we begin with the problems of the Anthropocene? It's racist, it's sexist, it's imperialist, it denies capitalism, all these things. Now, that said, I think the narrower version of, you know, Will Steffens and Zalasiewicz and those folks, the narrower position about the geological argument, that's fine. I think the geological dimension is fine. I think what happened is that the geological argument and the geological findings became transposed into historical arguments. And what that does, and you see this very clearly in the arguments about the Great Acceleration, is it takes what I would call, from the great English historian Edward Hallett Carr, it takes basic facts, though they are real facts, and it transforms them into historical facts, that is, statements about historical patterns. And that procedure, as historical social scientists know very well, is a very difficult one. It's not a simple translation to take basic facts about climate change and translate those into historical patterns, into historical analysis. And I think that's what's happened. And so I think that's the deeper problem. Of course, there are the issues of neo-Malthusianism and kind of substantialist reading of resources and all that are deeply ingrained in that discourse. But it's so, yes, it is so profoundly problematic that my arguments about the Capitalocene, of course, influenced by Andreas very early on, my argument started by talking with a friend of mine, a great young scholar, and I wrote to her these top 10 reasons why the Anthropocene is terrible, and it included all these things, the racism and the sexism and the, avoiding class and all of this, technological determinism. My worry is that even some parts of the left have embraced the Anthropocene. And I'm thinking, really, is this the best historical interpretation we can do? One that goes back to England and technological determinism? Really? After decades of the critique of Eurocentric historiography, of the critique of technical determinism, of the critique of neo-Malthusianism. And so I think it does need to be engaged. But the Capitalocene is simply, for me, a metaphorical device to say, look, we need to be dealing with the problems of capitalism. But we also need to be critical of how many Marxists and many people on the left have treated the question of capitalism, which is as a social system that is not part of nature, as if capitalism and capitalist relations somehow developed in this social laboratory and then came out into the world and did all these terrible things. No, it was a cascading series of transformations in which, yes, capitalism produced global nature, but also it was produced by global natures in successive and cascading transformations. And once we lose sight of that, I think we disable our politics.
Maybe one last question, and then we have to do the break.
You can find me during the break and ask.
Or we can just take the questions jointly, and then
Okay.
have a final say.
I'm the lucky one. During your presentation, did you say that historical capitalism created underproduction, underconsumption? If so, can you please clarify that? I think I missed that. I mean, I cannot understand how.
Mm-hmm.
And also, in this historical long-term analysis, do you have a criteria for evaluating this over and under, like capitalism creates over accumulation, and then what's that over, about what? Or if it's under what? Is there a criteria for that you can clarify? Thank you.
I was wondering what you have to say more explicitly about technology. If we could speak of something as technology in general, like you spoke of nature in general and production in general. And of course, I don't want to put the position of technological optimism or technological determinism, but it seems like it's very central to this connection between nature and capitalism. It seems the part of the principal ways in which they flow through each other. And at some points you've hinted at technology as though it were something endogenous to capitalism, something that comes out of its efforts to expand. But there's also a random component, right? There's also this effort you've been mentioning about trying to increase productivity and not being able to. So do you have a more explicit idea about this? I guess?
There's one in the back there.
Just to ask, what is nature you are talking? Where is nature? Historically, who the nature belongs to and why?
Did we get everyone? Okay, first of all, let me say before I forget and close without saying it, what a fantastic set of questions and amazing, fertile questions for conversation that I hope can continue. The question about underproduction and overproduction. For Marx, overproduction, of course, has to do with the problem of effective demand. Now, it's more than that, okay? And there's the question of the competition within production and the rising organic composition of capital. But broadly, what I mean is overproduction in the sense of too many commodities relative to what the market can bear. Underproduction is a question of inputs. So is a question of circulating capital, as it was for Marx. circulating capital is part of constant capital, and therefore a crucial moment of the rising organic composition of capital, which I realize sounds really abstruse, but I think is quite fundamental to understanding how capitalism works with and through nature, and how nature works for capitalism in the modern world. So the criteria is value composition and price of those inputs. The question of technology, it depends what kinds of technologies we're talking about. The kinds of technologies that I had in mind in walking through these stories and these models, those technologies were epoch-making technologies. So the steam engine is a good example. The steam engine appears as this technological marvel, which it is, and it owes its epoch-making capacity to very cheap nature, coal. And the extraordinary thing about fossil fuels, of course, is that they allow for prodigious increases in labor productivity. So every time oil prices have gone up over the past 50 years or so, labor productivity goes down. So when the price of energy goes up, labor productivity goes down. That seems to me a quite ominous, at least for capitalism, quite ominous development. So I see technology in that sense, in the sense of epochal inventions, as about a way of sucking up cheap nature and producing cheap nature. It's not like those use values were somehow pre-existing. And as we know, coal had many different use values, even across the 3 centuries after 1530, when English coal mining really begins to take off. So the question of technology is very central. At the same time, I think that it should be situated within a broader conception of technics, which I would borrow from Lewis Mumford, the great historian and, of course, urban critic, but also, I think, underappreciated for technics and capitalism, which was about 80 years ahead of its time. The techniques to understand that knowledge and power and machinery are dialectically relational. The question of nature is very important, and I think, of course, we could spend all day and all week talking about that. Just preliminarily, the way that I approach that is in two main ways, although there's more. First of all, let's recognize, yes, there is such a thing as nature in general, and it's out there. There is, a certain amount of solar energy reaching this planet. There are certain biogeochemical processes that work in certain ways. So there's nature in general. So maybe there's 3 ways. Nature in general. There is nature with a capital N, which is the invention of capitalism, which is to see nature is out there. Nature is out there, and nature is environments without humans. And society is humans without nature, and that's quite foundational to the whole praxis of imperialism and technological development and all sorts of rationalizations, both of human and extra-human populations and landscapes across the centuries. And then there's nature with a lowercase n. The metaphor I like to use is the web of life. I think we could probably use others. That understands capitalism as a double internality, that capitalism internalizes the relations of the web of life, unevenly, to be sure, and partially, to be sure, and the web of life internalizes the relations of capitalism in its successive phases of development. So climate change is a good example of this, that the climate system has internalized the contradictions of capitalism, even as capitalism is today increasingly internalizing the contradictions of climate change. And I think that gives us some basis for distinguishing the uses of this great and complex term, nature. That is nature in general, that's one. Nature with a capital N, as in cheap nature, part of the praxis of capitalism. And then nature as the double internality, as a process. So thank you. Thank you so much for those wonderful questions. Jason, what you say about the Capitalocene, that's right, but you have all these hidebound Marxists who say, well, here's capitalism as sort of this independent social sphere over here. And that's really the problem with people talking about the Capitalocene. And so I say, well, you know, if you deal with it, if you deal with capitalism as a double internality, you have a very different kind of approach. If you understand that capitalism is both producer and product of the web of life, you have a different set of possibilities. So I think that what we need to return to in order to understand the exhaustion of the capitalist model in organizing the relations between humans and the rest of nature, the exhaustion of that model that began 5 to 6 centuries ago and that is now coming to an end, we need to understand both the exhaustion of its value model that is premised on, as Marx famously tells us, on socially necessary labor time. We need to understand the exhaustion of that model, and also, I'll just tease a bit here, the rise of what I've called, stealing from Phil McMichael and others, the rise of a new ontological politics. Food sovereignty is a great example of this, but also right to the city, climate justice, I think in certain senses degrowth, where the issue delinks the old distributional demands and says distributional demands and the valuation of nature and humans' place within it are all of a piece, that you cannot delink the question of value and the question of equity. And so what I would emphasize is that from the beginning, we have of capitalism, even in the 16th century, and I realize that this goes against the grain of a certain very Anglo-centric, Eurocentric reckoning of the origins of capitalism as having everything to do with the Industrial Revolution. It doesn't. What we see is the rise of a new way of valuing reality that begins from the long 16th century, that it is premised on an extraordinary shift in the history of civilization from land productivity to labor productivity in the dominant patterns of power and production and reproduction. And when we say labor productivity, we mean this in a broader sense than economists talk about it, but fundamentally in terms of an advancing rate of surplus value. And so what we need to understand is that every act of producing surplus value requires a much larger and disproportionate act of appropriating the unpaid work of human and extra-human natures in order to sustain it, for reasons that I will try to make clear over the next little bit. So, of course, capitalism only values what it can count, and it can, while it can measure many things, it can only count really one thing, which is socially necessary labor time. And because the condition of value in this narrow sense is that most work, most purposeful activity, most activity of extra-human nature is by definition devalued. That the condition of some work being valued is that most work is not. So is that this nature-society binary is arbitrary, it's a violent abstraction, both in intellectual terms, it's a fetish, and in terms of real political and material activity, and it obscures crucial dimensions of our reality because it creates separate boxes of reality that are ontologically prior to each other. I think that what's dawning on a lot of us is that political ecology or world ecology in the ways that I'm talking about it, and by the way, that's world ecology with a hyphen, not the ecology of the world, and I'll try to make that more clear as we go through. I think what's happening is that we understand that political ecology is about more than political ecology of. It's about more than the political ecology of a social process. That we understand that we're not dealing with the political ecology of financialization, that financialization is in itself a crucial modality of environment making in the modern world. So in other words, Wall Street is a way of organizing nature. And when I say organizing nature, I mean human and extra-human nature. So I think one of the crucial challenges that we need to face, and there are several, but this is what I'd like to focus on today, is to move beyond the political ecology, political economy divide. And I think what's happened, and it's a welcome development, is that political ecologists invoke political economy, the political economy of capitalism, of endless accumulation, of the spatial fix, you name it. And the political economists now, certainly critical political economists, Marxist political economists, now have to recognize that in some sense nature, yes, nature matters. Who would have thought? Okay, so, and in this divide, you can see it even in people who are leading authorities on both questions, somebody like John Bellamy Foster. So for John Bellamy Foster, the theory of the tendency of the surplus to rise is abstracted from nature in every sense. And you can make similar observations about a whole string of political economists, that nature still does not really matter to the dominant models of critical and Marxist political economy. We can name a number of exceptions, of course, but I would think if we look at the main accounts of the post-2008 global economy, we see a very strong generalized persistence of this divide. And I think what we need to say is that political ecology provides some of the raw materials for an emerging synthesis with political economy, and that moving beyond this, oh yeah, nature matters, to looking at the models of accumulation and crisis will give us some crucial insights into not only the realities of the present, but how to forge the politics of the present. So what I'd like to focus on in this talk is, I think, is one line of synthesis, and I think that this is one line of many complementary syntheses that need to occur. This is a synthesis with the world historical tradition. At dinner last night, we were having a wonderful conversation about the tradition of political ecology, which is really regional political ecology. And it's a wonderful and dynamic tradition. And there has been a tendency to construct systemic processes as theoretical rather than as concrete historical geographical relations and processes. That yes, the modern world system is a real place, a real historical geographical place with real patterns of the exercise of power, of culture, of environment making, and so on and so forth. And yes, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, but it's also less. Okay, we get that. What we need to do is to move beyond the theoretical construction of the global, and conversely, what we've seen in, say, world environmental history and other global narratives of environmental change is not only an entrenched and pervasive nature-society dualism, but an inability to deal very well with regional dynamics and how do these two inform each other. And this is a particular concern of mine looking at accounts of global environmental change. The Anthropocene is a good example of this, but we could multiply that many, many times over, is that there is still this idea of nature as nature in general. So when, especially when the political economy tradition of environmental change deals with the question of nature, you look at the metabolic rift tradition, for instance, it is nature in general. There is a strong non-recognition that natures are historically specific and that there are specific historical natures, a wonderful term that Marx and Engels give us from the German ideology. There are specific historical natures that are both producer and product of specific eras of capitalist development. So when we make the pitch for world ecology, we are not arguing for a brand new theory. We are arguing for a new mode of theorizing that is historically grounded. What we mean by historically grounded is grounded in the interpretation of historical change in the modern world. And this is a method in the broadest sense of the term, not in terms of research design, of course, but in how do we go about bounding time, space, and nature in the making and unmaking of the modern world. And so this carries forth the tradition of the philosophy of internal relations, which has had great influence both in political ecology and in the world historical tradition. But as Michael Watts once said to me, he said, yeah, well, you know what Phil McMichael writes about incorporating comparison, that's all really interesting and everything, but nobody really does it. And I think that there were good reasons for why people didn't do it. And I think that this is also a limit, that we need to understand that understanding philosophically the relationality of humanity and nature and humanity asks us to deal with the systemic processes of world historical change. That asks us to bring to bear a different set of narrative strategies. That the narrative strategies that work for regional analysis do not necessarily matter for systemic analyses. And there's a tension there that I think needs to be teased out. So when we say that the modern world system is a capitalist world ecology, we say that this means that the
Thank you. What a pleasure it is to be here, an honor it is to be here. I've been aware, of course, of the work of the Entitled group, been in conversation with some of the students. You want me to?
You have to use it, otherwise the video won't get
okay.
your noise.
This feels like I'm giving a motivational speech here. Yes, you can be an effective scholar. Let me tell you how. All right. So I want to thank Begum and Amelie and everyone for inviting me and making it possible for me to come. It's a great honor to be here and to be engaged in the kinds of conversations that Entitle has been nurturing and encouraging. And that is how I would like to present this talk today, not as a series of closed formulations, but as a series of provocations and invitations to the kinds of conversations for a post-Cartesian historical social science that we so desperately need, I think both for intellectual reasons and for political reasons. I think that the dualism of nature and society is not only a violent abstraction in the sense that it abstracts and reifies realities that should not be abstracted and reified, but I think that it is also implicated in a very real violence and blood and dirt, as Marx would say, of the modern world. So this is a series of invitations to talk about the end of cheap nature and what that has meant historically. And at some places in this talk, I will move fairly fast. Other places, I'll move slower. But we'll begin, of course, we know nature is never cheap. All of us would agree with that in this room, I suspect. All of us would carry a very different normative, ethico-political project around what we wish to value relative to historical capitalism, which values basically one thing: labor productivity in the circuit of capital. So we have to ask this question of what is valuable. I think that this has been implicit and at times very explicit in political ecology. I think by and large those discussions have focused on the ethico-political dimensions of what we want to value rather than a deep critique of how capitalism works through the web of life. And so the big pitch that I would make to you is something that will be familiar to most in political ecology. That is, how do we move from thinking about capitalism and nature to capitalism in the web of life? Capitalism in nature, nature in capitalism. This is what I call the double internality as a methodological premise, and that's something I'll return to in just a few moments. So we begin with, I think, what is either implicit or explicit in a lot of green thought, which accumulation of capital, the pursuit of power, and the co-production of nature are dialectically interpenetrated in an organic and evolving whole. So not three overlapping circles in those well-worn Venn diagrams, because the Venn diagrams still presume an ontological independence. And so what we are saying methodologically, and this is the crucial methodological move, how do we take Raymond Williams' great insight that we are, and human organizations, including capitalism and empires and cities, that these are at once producers and products simultaneously of the web of life? How do we start to ground that? And of course, we have Eric Swingdow in the audience here, who's so greatly advanced our understanding of all of this. I'm not claiming a tremendous novelty here, but the novelty is in grounding this in the world historical patterns of power and production and reproduction in the web of life in the era of capitalist development. And that's been a crucial lacuna in the conversation and in critical geography especially, that there's been a real difficulty in dealing with world historical patterns and a real tendency to treat those as mere context or theoretical constructs rather than real evolving historical geographical patterns. So when we say, of course, that capitalism makes nature and nature makes capitalism, that both flow through each other, shaping each other, we understand, of course, that they are asymmetrical, and that the relations of capitalism and nature and capitalism are always historically specific. Hence, the centrality of historical nature, so that we need to have a conceptualization of nature that is historically specific. It's striking that at a time when no serious political economist would take Marx's concept of nature in general as appropriate to understanding neoliberalism's global transformations of accumulation, financialization, flexible specialization, all of that. You wouldn't use production in nature for any of that. We wouldn't use production in general for any of that. We would use a specific historical conception of how production is organized. And it's striking that today we still have this very powerful hold of nature out there that is very much inscribed in our conceptual vocabulary. And we can talk more about that. Now, in regional political ecology, of course, you all know how to deal with this, which is rich, thick description. That's wonderful. It's entirely appropriate, and I think it's been fairly successful. When the enterprise is understanding how capitalism as a systemic historical process works, or a set or bundle of historical processes work, a different conceptual vocabulary is clearly in order, and you can see the consequences of not adopting this, that you continue to have a very strong dualist frame when we deal with systemic processes. So what we want to do is to emphasize that when we talk about the Capitalocene, and I encounter this all the time, I was going back and forth with the great social theorist Mackenzie Wark, and he says, oh yeah,